From Toronto to Tokyo, and from Thonia to Syrinx, this is The Basement, your companion to the Ready Player One novel. Join our hosts each episode for complete chapter breakdowns and deep dives into the pop culture references through a series of challenges and homework assignments. The Basement is the Ready Player One podcast for people who love things. And now, please welcome Albert and the rest of the Gunchers for this week's episode. Hello, Gunchers, and welcome back to The Basement. My name is Albert Padilla, your host tonight, as we close out Chapter 3 of the Ready Player One novel in an episode that we're calling Highlander Too Lame, which is a direct reference to this particular chapter. And to ensure that tonight's episode isn't Highlander Too Lame, though no promises, returning once again from a grueling 2 weeks of homework assignments and challenges that we gave him, and probably the only living member of the Alan Parsons Project fan club, please welcome Bad Gamer Crowley.
I'm not sure any of that is accurate.
It is all 100% inaccurate in every way.
Perfect.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be back. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to close out Chapter 3.
Yeah, it's been a long chapter, that's for sure. And there's been a lot of stuff on here. We were talking right before we came on the air that there's so many rabbit holes that we could go, honestly, with some of this content in terms of like when you start doing the research, you start realizing just how much some really bad things are connected to really other bad things, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's no end to that in sight, but hopefully you had a good time having fun doing all the homework assignments.
Oh, absolutely. This is just a trip down memory lane, and it kind of gives you, when you go through these and you do these, I call them challenges, you call them homework. When you do these, it really gives you just a crystal clear idea of what the author was trying to get to in Ready Player One. So this is, with me, the book being so fresh in my mind, this is actually just brilliant. It's phenomenal. So thank you for having me on. This is great.
Cool. So before we get into it, we don't really have any news to speak of as of right now. So what I'd like to do just really quickly, we had two recent iTunes reviews. So I want to give out two quick shout outs. The first one's from NorCal Joe. He says, right on with a thumbs up, gave us a 5-star review. These guys have great insight on 80s pop culture zeitgeist with compliments, which complements the Ready Player One centric podcast while going through each chapter of the book. From cornflakes to diatribes on Oingo Boingo and Duran Duran, this is definitely a must listen to. So NorCal Joe, thank you first off for the 5-star review and for the positive feedback on the show. And I knew we had something special once I saw that Cornflakes and Oingo Boingo were in the very first release of the show notes. So it's been good. Yeah. And the second one is from TMK71. And it says, not what I wanted it to be. It says, I enjoyed the couple of first episodes very much, but cannot listen anymore. Albert is a great host and has done his homework, but the pickering and flaming of 80s kids movies and music by the adult guests is just not what I wanted to hear celebrating Ready Player One. So first off, a huge thank you to TMK71 for your honest and candidness in your review. And he actually brings up, or he or she brings up brings up something that I lightly addressed, I think, in either the last episode or the one before that. But, when I was kind of brainstorming, trying to come up with a name for the show, I had a whole bunch of different ideas kind of all on the table. And I think I just landed on The Basement because I really felt like that was, it would capture the tone of the show, and at least what I was trying to get at with the show. And particularly in that we're not always going to all agree on what's good, what's not, what sucks, what doesn't, that kind of thing. And it really kind of plays to, again, this particular chapter that we just happen to be on here in Chapter 3, where you've got H and Parzival going back and forth, and they're arguing about these things. And going in, I kind of knew that was going to be the case. So I guess the one common thread that I would say for all of our hosts is we all enjoy the novel. And honestly, even if they didn't, I probably would still invite somebody on if they had, some compelling stuff to share with the podcast. But for the most part, everyone seems to really enjoy the novel. And I think where we differ is really on all of the pop culture references. But I think that's okay. I don't know that as someone who does a Star Wars podcast, I can assure you that I'm no stranger to the fact that some audiences are always looking for something more, celebratory in terms of of the content. And respectfully, when it comes to pop culture stuff, this isn't that show. Though I think everyone here, again, that's been on here is a big fan of the novel. So anyways, all that to say, thank you for all of the feedback and definitely appreciate it. And sorry if the show isn't for you. Hopefully you'll find your way back onto it at some point. So with that, let's just get into chapter 3. So let's recap real quick. So Wade, he's had a few moments before school started, and he jumps into H's chat room, which is the basement. We just spoke about that. And both Wade and H are kind of in the middle of this escalating exchange between, what is canon, what is not, what's good, what isn't. And he makes a reference to Halliday owning both Howard the Duck and Krull, and all in the context of another movie that's really contentious, which is Lady Hawk, right? They're kind of talking about Lady Hawk and whether or not that's one of the movies. And we're doing something special with Lady Hawk, so we won't be talking about it here. But this is, that we covered Howard the Duck in the last episode, but we didn't. We kind of broke right in between that sentence. And so the first thing we have is Krull. And this is the one I was honestly looking forward to for a very long time, because it was a movie that as a kid, as much as I like Star Wars, I kind of knew that this was, to me, it seemed like, it's even as a child, it seemed kind of like a ripoff, but I didn't really care so much. I thought it was really neat. And so let me go over some really brief things, and I'll kind of turn it over you to Crowley to kind of give me some feedback first off. But it was directed by Peter Yates, and it was originally credited as a science fiction swashbuckling type film. It's got a number of people in here that were, that went on to do other things, but it had Ken Marshall as, is it Cowan, I think is his name? Lisette Anthony as Princess Lissa, and then Trevor Martin, who's the voice of the Beast. But I think the real stories with the casting were some of the co-hosts or the co-actors that, like notably Liam Neeson, right, who's Qui-Gon Jinn. And then we had Robbie Coltrane, who played Hagrid from Harry Potter. And these guys didn't even have names. They weren't even credited. They were just known as like bandits or something. And they were led by this guy named Torquil, who was played by Alan Armstrong, we'll get to Alan Armstrong in just a second. But first off, I guess, Crowley, was this a movie that you remember from your childhood? And if so, did you have fond memories? Is this something that you were trying to rub out over the last, 30, 40 years?
No, I don't think I tried to rub it out. I just don't. It wasn't a memorable movie for me. Like when you talk about memorable movies from my childhood, all of the Star Wars, most of the Star Trek, those kind of movies, those stuck with you. The themes, the special effects, just the overall, I guess the story arcs of the movies, they all stuck with you, or with me for one reason or another. This one, it didn't really stick with me. And the more I thought about it, it wasn't that it was a terrible film, because I watched this one all the way through. And I was able to get through it, and I wasn't distracted like I was,
That says a lot, right? That you can get to the movie first off.
Yeah, because I couldn't get through the Ewok movies. Those were just terrible. Yeah. Howard the Duck I got through, but this I was able to get through, and the effects are dated, sure, as they are with most films from this era. But you asked if it was trying to capitalize on Star Wars. And I don't know if it really was, because Star Wars was truly, and I think you've talked about this probably on this show and the Cantina cast, is that it's science fantasy. It's not so much science fiction as it is science fantasy. This one, while sure it had like the laser guns, it was more fantasy than it was anything else. Like the swords played a large part in it. The mythical creatures played a large part in it. It wasn't so much like there weren't space battles. It was just talk of this is a different planet and there's a galaxy this guy's trying to take over. It just felt more fantasy than it did science fantasy, at least to me, watching it as an adult.
Yeah. No, and it's fair criticism. And if we could just, and we can get into it right now. I mean, so this particular movie, so Krull went through it was very expensive, and it went through a very like harsh and dangerous production process, beginning to end. I mean, and when I say dangerous, like the actors were like put in these positions of true danger at certain moments within it. But going back to its original script, right? So when it was originally pitched, I think this thing was called the dragons of Krull or something like that. And originally they wanted to have it. It was supposed to be a fantasy kind of movie. And if you think back to the time when this movie came out, I mean, we had a lot of movies that were out at this time that were all fantasy. This was like almost in its prime as far as movie making goes. You had like Dragon Slayer, you had the Conan movies, you had Beastmaster. If you want to get into some weird ones like Deathstalker and Hawk the Slayer, right? There was just tons and tons of these coming out. It was almost like an exploitation of that particular genre in the early to mid 80s. And again, when it first came out, the first script was called The Dragons of Krull. And it went through a couple of different revisions. And originally, the beast in this movie was supposed to be a dragon. And after, I think, the second revision, they had backed it out. And so, no, he was no longer a dragon. He was more like this reptilian-looking creature. And that's why he kind of looks the way he does. His origins were as a dragon. And after it was, a couple more revisions later, they decided, okay, we need to add in more science fantasy element. And I don't really know where that came into play. My guess is that, again, this is where I posed the question was it too much like Star Wars? I just assumed that they were trying to capitalize on Star Wars, Star Trek, because those movies were really kind of hitting their prime as well in that time. And so they were kind of maybe trying to ride the fence here and play, have the best of both worlds, so to speak. But to your point, outside of the laser bolts, I mean, there really isn't a whole lot of science fiction in here, right?
No, except for the cast. Like you said, Qui-Gon Jinn is in the movie, but the lead, Ken Marshall, is actually tied to Star Trek. He played Lieutenant Commander Michael Eddington on Deep Space Nine, and he had a very controversial, I guess, story arc where he joined a terrorist organization and they eventually killed him off. So when I started watching this movie, I went, I know this dude from somewhere and I'm going to figure it out. And halfway through the movie, I went, Star Trek. He's in Star Trek. And at about the time I figured it out, I went, holy crap, that's Qui-Gon Jinn.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, talk about crossing the streams.
Yeah, that's true. And so we're kind of jumping around, but one of the things, so I asked you about pros and cons, and I'll jump into one of the pros that I have for it. And it's not really a big pro, or I guess a big high, so to speak, for the movies. But the movie is kind of, if I'm being completely honest, as an adult, I look back at this movie and watched it, and I've seen it twice in the last 2 weeks. Don't ask why, but I've seen it twice in the last 2 weeks. And it's kind of a boring movie. Like, yes. It's got moments where it's just like, I don't know. I really have a hard time staying focused or staying tuned into the movie. But the only thing that I felt like was really keeping me going were some of the actors themselves and the portrayals of the characters. Like Liam Neeson, even though he's got this small role, and I'm just going to call him Qui-Gon Jinn because I don't know he didn't have a name, so that's his name now. But like Qui-Gon Jinn's character in this movie he's actually pretty entertaining, and it's a credit to him. Same with like Robbie Coltrane and really a lot of the actors. They really kind of made the best with what they had, I guess, so to speak. And the cast is really an ensemble cast. Like, it's got a lot of famous people that did nothing over here in the States. They were all huge in British movies. And they've got this, and if you go back and look at some of their works respectively and individually, they've done a lot of amazing stuff over there. They were in a ton of different movies. I mean, these guys were kind of like really kind of the big deal over there for a number of years in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And of course, again, as Americans, we don't know who the heck any of these people are. But yeah, that was kind of like a high for me, is the fact that they were able to keep the movie, entertaining. I thought they all did. Most of them did a pretty good job of acting. What other things did you have? I don't know if it's a short list or not, but what other things did you have for highs there for the movie?
It was entertaining. Like, it was entertaining. The character actors, because that's what most of these guys are, except for maybe Liam Neeson. They have roles. They're role players. To give it a sports analogy, they're role players. And the fact that they were able to carry a movie for however long this movie was, it was about 2 hours. The fact that they could carry it and keep my attention as an adult without it waning too far, most of the time, is a credit to them. Now, that's literally the only high that I can find in this movie. Uh, but it's all subjective, isn't it? Like everything is subjective. I mean, I do a gaming podcast, and you want to talk about a community that gets divided quickly. Everything is just subjective anymore, and it's all point of view, and it's all personal experiences that people bring to it. So for me, I enjoyed the science aspect of it, or the fantasy aspect of it, because I don't know. It kind of differentiated itself from the Star Wars and the Star Treks and the Flash Gordons and these science fiction, science fantasy movies that were around during that time. This had less sci and more fantasy. And so for me, I guess that would be that could be considered a high.
Yeah. And I guess we kind of skipped over the plot, I guess. And briefly, it's really about this prince who's supposed to marry this, I guess, a princess. Princess, right? Yeah. And their wedding gets crashed unexpectedly by these slayers, I guess is what they call them.
Sure.
And the princess gets kidnapped by the beast. The slayers report up to the beast. They take her, they go into this black fortress, and this black fortress constantly, every morning, changes location. It teleports across the land. And so, this guy is going on this quest to go find his princess. And along the way, he meets a number of different people. Again, part of this, this team, this ensemble cast of characters. There's like a cyclops. There's a wizard who can transform himself into different animals. There is an old, seer at one point that they run into. They run into those bandits that we talked about. So those become like his merry men, so to speak. And they've got a little backstory where they're prisoners and they've got shackles on, and only the prince can unlock the shackles. And guess what? It turns out I'm the prince and I can unshackle those. And so, eventually they make their way to the fortress, and they go through a number of, trials and tribulations, getting up to the princess. Some of them die, some of them live, and they rescue her and all of that. But I think one of the other things, I guess, that was a high for me, speaking about the movie itself, was the glaive. Like, that weapon as a kid was just the coolest looking thing to me. And I don't know if it was because I was just obsessed with all of the ninja movies that were starting to come out and all the karate stuff, but it always looked like a really cool Chinese star. But that weapon is so iconic for me, at least anyways. And it ends up coming up in the Ready Player One movie. It's the weapon that Sho pulls out and throws right at the very end and lobs Irok's arm off as well. So it did make it into the movie, even though it wasn't referenced, explicitly in the novel. Did that weapon ever do anything for you?
No. It did, and I'll tell you why. I realized this as I watched the movie this last time. The story it doesn't flow for me.
Yeah.
Like, it starts in the middle. I felt like there needed to be more exposition on where they're going or where they've been and why they're going to where they're going with the story. And then literally the whole time he's climbing, the shots of him climbing to get the glaive. I'm like, who directed this? Like, on what planet was this good filmmaking ever?
So, I actually have that as one of my lows as well, because if you go back, by the way, if you haven't had a chance to see this recently, you can find it free on YouTube. Someone's uploaded the whole thing. It's in high def, and you can watch this movie. But I didn't remember that part. In both viewings, that was the one thing that stood out for me. It was like, what is happening? It was like just going on and on and on. And it was like shot after shot, angle after angle. It's like somebody was very proud of the fact that they made all these on-location shots somewhere.
I think they had to justify the expense. They were like,
yeah, exactly. We're using this footage. I don't care if this is a 10-minute segment of one man climbing up a mountain with nothing else happening but a soundtrack. That's exactly what it turned out to be. But yeah, I had that as one of my lows because it just kept going on. It goes on way too long. But and so the other thing I had as a low for me was the glaive itself, because we're told at the very beginning of the movie that the only thing that can defeat this beast, right, is the glaive. Mm-hmm. And so he goes on this quest, goes up there, has a leap of faith and sticking his hand in I assume it's lava, I guess. It's supposed to be lava. It looks like pudding or jello. But he puts his hand in lava and pulls it out, and he's got this weapon, and you're thinking, okay, he's got it, right? He's got a way to beat this beast. And then we get to the end, fast forward to the end of the movie, he throws the glaive at the beast and it sticks in the beast and he can't get it back. It doesn't kill the beast and he can't get it back. And I'm thinking, okay, so what was the point? It was supposed to be the only thing that killed him. And in the end, it wasn't that. It turned out to be the fact that they loved each other, right? And they had that flame and all of that. But that was one of the other, I guess, lows, because I think it took a lot out. Well, it did. It took everything out of the fact that this was this, sacred Excalibur type weapon that he went out in search of.
And doesn't it kind of like, I don't know about you, but when I watched the movie, I was comparing it because of the time that it was made. I was like, okay, well, let's just compare this to Star Wars. And even though they're kind of different genres, I kept going, okay, so he gets this weapon, right? And the very first thing, he comes down and he's going to throw the weapon to see what it does. He's never wielded this thing in the life. And the Obi-Wan Kenobi character, I don't even remember his name, the old man, looks at with the cool mustache that I really want to grow. He puts his hand up and he goes, no, don't use that. You must only use it to kill the beast. The time will come and you will know when it is. And I'm like, wait, he's got apparently the most powerful weapon in all the realms. And
we waited 10 minutes for him to get it.
Right. We had to watch him climb several hills, very steep, full of rocks. And now he can't use it.
He doesn't use it until the very end of the movie. Like, it literally is like towards the very end of the movie.
At least Luke got to practice with the lightsaber for a while.
True. Yeah, there was some instant gratification there. Because, he ignites it right, the first time he grabs it.
He almost took his face off with it.
Yeah, him and the old man.
Yeah.
But, all right, so real quickly, some other highs for me. The soundtrack. So James Horner did the soundtrack for this. And, I was a big fan of his work from, I think, honestly, the very first thing that I recall ever wondering, I wonder who did the music, was the Star Trek movie. And then obviously Wrath of Khan. But I get shades of it here. Like, you can hear it, right? It's very James Horner.
For sure.
And he would go on to do some really more amazing stuff in the 90s, but this is some of his earliest work and probably some of his best work. And so I do think that this particular soundtrack is pretty special. All things considered, and certainly measuring it up against some of the other movies that were released around that time.
Yeah, and then I would agree. I don't have that in my notes, but I meant to put that in because when you watch this movie, you can't help but notice the music because it's so good. And some of these backdrops, like I said, they're dated. So you're trying to find things that get you into the movie, and the music just works. So I 100% agree.
And then the other thing I had was the fire mirrors, that particular scene. As a kid, I thought that was just the coolest thing it never really, now it bothers me the way they round these things up. It seems a little abusive, but whatever. But when they do finally get on them and they're riding and they ride out into the air and, there's the whole trail. It's a pretty long segment, but I think honestly, this goes back to what I just said about the music. That whole scene is set to some of the best music of the soundtrack. The soundtrack's really good. But that particular moment has got some of the best pieces in it, or one of the best pieces, I think. But yeah, it was kind of a cool moment to see them, riding these horses in the air, and there's this long trail of fire that looks like a smudgy thing on, because of the special effects. But yeah, it was good. I enjoyed that. And I guess just some of the last things, some of the other notes that I've got here. This movie was not a financial success by any stretch of any mark. I think total it was I think $47 million budget. Now put that in perspective. Star Wars in 1977 was made on about 12 million. Empire Strikes Back was made on about 18. That bloated up to about 30 million when it was all said and done. And then Return of the Jedi finished somewhere around the 32 million mark. So you're talking Jedi finished at 32 million and this movie went at $47 million. So they were way, way over budget. I think total it only took in, at least in the U.S., I want to say it was like 12 million or 18 million, I think, somewhere around there. It was a significant hit in terms of what it actually brought in. 16 million is what I have here on my notes in terms of what it took in. It sits at about 33% on Rotten Tomatoes. I threw the question out there whether or not it had reached cult status. It wasn't reviewed very well even at the time. And it seems like it's hit or miss. I would say most people I talk to, either you're on one of two sides. Either you thought this movie was amazing and still do, probably because you haven't seen it recently, or you really didn't like it even then back then. But I I would have to say that I still, having watched it both times, I think there's enough here for me to say that I actually really do enjoy this movie. And I actually watched it. I made the kids watch this movie. So my 3 boys, so I've got a 13, 7, and an 8-year-old. They sat down and they were kind of poking fun of it at first because they were looking at me kind of weird, like, why are we watching this movie? But then, 45 minutes in, they didn't want me to pause it. If someone had to get up, use the bathroom, they wanted to pause. So they were into it, and they watched it all the way through the end. When I kind of pulled them afterwards, they liked it. So I think it does appeal to the younger audience, and it probably still has that. I think, like you said earlier, probably didn't hold up well, and as you get older, doesn't probably have that same appeal anymore.
Well, how much stuff from our youth can we say doesn't hold up well now when you go back and look at it? I mean, look at all the cartoons from the 80s, the Transformers, and I mean, it was just marketing. So I don't know if that's a good judge of whether or not it deserves cult status, is if it holds up well now that you're an adult. I think that these movies, Star Wars included, are, for the most part, I think Star Trek's a little more adult, but this genre is pretty much geared towards kids. And if kids like it, then kids like it. And if you don't go back and you don't watch it and you remember it and that nostalgia feeling that you get when you think about it, great, good for you. Then it's a cult and it deserves to be cult status. For me, it deserves to be free on YouTube.
We'll have to add that in as another category when we rate these things. Is this worthy of being free on YouTube? Yes or no?
Yes.
And there's some other stuff in here, legacy stuff. We won't get to it just because I want to make sure we stay under 4 hours. But Alan Dean Foster did the novelization, which seems kind of par for course around this time, right? If you had a movie that was science fiction or science fantasy based, Alan Dean Foster was probably going to write your novelization. Parker Brothers had a board game. They also had a card game. There was a 2600 video game. There was an arcade game. There was a lot of different tie-ins for this IP. And since then, there's never really been anything else. They've never done a sequel. There was never any kind of like a cartoon that came out or anything else. But yeah, it definitely has.
This would have made a great cartoon.
Yeah. Like, it probably could have. Yeah, I don't know.
It's not a terrible story. I mean, the story was told terribly, but just because it was told terribly doesn't mean that it's a terrible story. I think the story has merit. It has some value. I think if you rework it just a little bit, this could be a hit. The story's solid. The acting was even solid. I think you bring it up to date. There should be a reboot of Krull. I'm going to throw that out there right now. Somebody needs to reboot this.
Maybe they will do it. Get it out there. Okay. Let's move on from Krull. And so really at this point, H is kind of really giving it to Parzival here. He's making fun of Lady Hawk. He's making fun of the costumes, the props. And then he takes a shot at the soundtrack of Lady Hawk, which was done by the Alan Parsons project, that finally ends up in a big, wind up in where he calls Lady Hawk Beyond Lame, Highlander 2 Lame. Which again, that's where we get the title for the episode. But Kyle, I only have one question for you.
Yes.
Is the Alan Parsons project lame, and is it Highlander 2 lame?
Okay. Well, first, I object to the use of the term Highlander 2 lame. And second, yes, it is 100%. That is an accurate statement.
All right. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Alan Parsons project, the Alan Parsons project was a band, I guess we'll call it that.
Sure.
Yeah. So it was a English rock band that was active between like 1975 and 1990. It was made up of Alan Parsons, spoiler alert, and a gentleman by the name of Eric Wolfson. And they were, so Parsons was kind of this up and coming artist. He actually had done work like on Abbey Road for the Beatles, Let It Be for the Beatles. He worked on Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. And then you had Wolfson, who was a songwriter and composer. But I couldn't find anything that really kind of spoke about how well established he was at the time. But these two guys got together, and Wolfson had this idea in his back of his head about creating music around Edgar Allan Poe's writing and works. And so in 1976, these guys teamed up and they released their first kind of album called Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And all the songs are titled after Edgar Allan Poe works. So you have got like Dream Within a Dream, The Raven, The Telltale Heart, The Cask of the Amontillado. And then there's like 5 tracks on that particular album that are all about the fall of the House of Usher. Sounds like super concept album, right? Then we got a lot of that here in the 70s and 80s, early 80s. But I think for I'm going to talk about that album real quick because there is one track on there that I'm going to admit that I actually like, and it is the Raven. And it Raven, that particular song, it's the one of the very first songs, and I kind of found contradictory reports whether it was the first or the second, but it was one of the very first. I guess they call them vocoders, whatever the thing's called. But it's basically a hardware thing that synthesizes your voice. So think of it as like the modern day version of like audio, or the audio tone or audio tune or whatever that program's called. And we can get into more of the Alan Parsons project. But how far did you get into the homework? Did you go down a rabbit hole? Did you stick to any of the songs that I sent you to listen to?
Yeah, I listened to them for a minute. Sorry. I could pretend to not trash Alan Parsons project, but I'm going to trash Alan Parsons project.
That's okay. I'll defend them. Go ahead.
Okay. Like
point and counterpoint.
Okay. So if pretentious could be a music genre, Alan Parsons project has nailed it.
Yeah. Okay, I can give you that. They do come across as a little pretentious for sure.
Like they have one redeeming song, and I don't even remember the name of the song, but it's what the Bulls came out to in the
Sirius. Right? That's the name of the song.
There you go. And it was Ricky the Dragon Steamboat's entrance music in WWF.
Yeah, that's right.
That's their one redeeming song. That's it. Like everything else, I believe could be categorized as a pretentious dumpster fire.
Okay, so in addition to Sirius, okay, so wait, let me go back. Their best, their biggest selling single was a song called "Eye in the Sky." It's from 1982. It got to number 3 in the U.S. Billboard charts, and that song is pretty good. I mean, it's kind of mellow, and they're not really rocking out, right? But it's a good song. I actually really enjoy that song. So that's one. You hit on it. So Sirius, which was 1982. So Sirius is that song that was, if you ever watched like the Chicago Bulls back in the old NBA days of like the 80s, and I think it was mostly around late 80s, early 90s, whenever they introduced the Chicago Bulls, and you had that famous announcer, I forget his name is, from North Carolina at guard 6'6", Michael Jordan, that whole thing. That particular song that you hear playing, it's all instrumental, is called Sirius. And that thing recently, in fact, just like 2 days ago, I was sitting on the couch and it came on in a Best Buy ad. So Best Buy's got an ad right now that they're running this thing as well. So,
of course they do.
Yep. And the other one was, what was the other? Oh, The Raven. That was the third song that I felt was a standout title. Apart from that, there is a lot of stuff in here that it's just not my cup of tea. And I really, if you listen to the show, I've got a pretty broad range of stuff that I listen to and enjoy. And I mean, I can put it on and not be forced to turn it off, but it's nothing I would actively go seek to listen to.
I would immediately change the station and then
that's probably fair.
Wish for that 30 seconds of my life back.
But but going back to the soundtrack for Lady Hawk, which, they did, that I can listen to as well. And it's really kind of it's a weird mix of music. Like they've got, there's their opening song for the Lady Hawk soundtrack. And that soundtrack, by the way, you can find it on YouTube. I know that. I don't know if they ever actually released it officially. I may have missed looking into that, but I know on YouTube, they've got all the music collected in there and you can listen to it for free. But if you do listen to it, if you listen to that song, The Raven, that I'm talking about, you can hear shades of that throughout the entire thing. In fact, most of the music that I think they did for Lady Hawk just seems like it's been, and I'm not trying to discredit anything, but it sounds like you can hear shades of it. It sounds like it's been borrowed from other stuff that they've done in some of their other studio albums. But it's not only just that kind of music, this synthesizer music, but they've got there's some monks chanting at one point. They've got some traditional, orchestrated type music for different parts in the movie. And it's not a bad soundtrack, but it's, again, if you like Alan Parsons' project, you're probably thinking, man, this is good stuff. And if you're not, you're probably like they were doing in the book here, where H is just making fun of Parzival for liking that particular soundtrack. So,
well, look, I'm not trying to take anything away from them as musicians. I think both, great musicians, obviously geniuses, I think would probably be a better term, musical geniuses. The problem is I live by a simple rule, which is never take yourself too seriously. And I just think that Alan Parsons Project takes themselves way too seriously. So
that's fair.
So I can see why there's that knock on them in the book. I mean, it makes sense because you're either really going to love them or you probably hate them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, this is another one where I don't know if there's a lot of common ground, but yeah, it's interesting. But you did bring up something that I'm going to just throw out there real quick, and I don't want to go down a too big of a rabbit hole, but you brought up Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, who was a WWF wrestler. Were you a big WWF fan back in the 80s?
Oh, absolutely. Like I remember,
I think most of America was, if we're being honest with ourselves. Oh,
for sure. I remember like the Saturday night main event. That was always a big deal. Like I would get to stay up. My dad would let me stay up, me and my brother, and we'd be able to watch that, whenever that was on. And then typically, the local station would have the WWF on early Sunday morning, 7, 8, 9 o'clock. So before church, every Sunday morning, we would sit there, and my dad, myself, and my brother, we would watch the WWF as my mom would get ready for church, because inevitably she would take longer than everybody else. Yep. So we'd get to sit there and watch it. And I was a huge fan. Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Later on, you've got like Lex Luger, Ultimate Warrior. So yeah, absolutely. Like, and I'm still into wrestling today. Like I was keeping up with the Money in the Bank pay-per-view that went on last night. And that's just the golden era of wrestling, man. That was it. And Ricky the Dragon, he was that guy that never got over as far as with the company. Like I don't believe he ever won the heavyweight title. No, he didn't. He was Intercontinental for a while, but he was a great wrestler. In fact, arguably the greatest wrestling match ever has him in it with Macho Man Randy Savage.
Was that in one of the WrestleManias that they did?
I believe it was WrestleMania 2 or 3. I don't remember off the top of my head, but that is typically when people talk about some of the greatest matches of all time, that is always in the conversation. So he's a great performer. He's a great wrestler. He worked with the WWE. He still may, but I think he officially retired in 2010, but he still might work with development. So.
Gotcha. Well, and he's a big Alan Parsons Project fan too, so
obviously
he's got that going.
Right.
No,
I wonder if the WWF had to pay a lot for that. I would imagine not.
I would imagine they probably didn't at the time, because I don't even think he used that song throughout his whole career. I remember early on he did, but I want to say maybe it was when he came back, because I think he left and then came back to the WWF, or came back to wrestling in some way, in some capacity. And he came into like a different song. So I don't know, maybe the royalties were up through the roof now that the Bulls were, using them in their championships and all that.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, and so I don't want to make this about WWF, because I don't think there's anything else that's even referenced in there, but that was a huge part of the 80s. I mean, make no mistake about it. I mean, there was a cartoon that was out. You had the Cyndi Lauper video, Girls Just Want to Have Fun, right? Where they're, it was the Goonies video, where they were there with Cyndi Lauper and the cast of the Goonies, right? They had Sergeant Slaughter and what was it? Andre the Giant. Who was the Russian guy?
Nikolai
Volkov.
Yeah, Nikolai Volkov. There you go. And the Iron Sheik.
Iron Sheik was in that video, right? Again, we had that 80s cartoon. I want to say there was like a cereal.
There was a cereal. There was
Running Wild.
There were ice cream bars. There's all kinds that are still referenced today. All that stuff is still referenced today within the WWE and the WWE universe, the fans. In fact, just a couple of years ago, CM Punk, before he left the WWE, referenced the ice cream bars. The WWE Network, they have a new cartoon. I mean, all this stuff anymore, it's geared towards kids and adults. Like they pushed the limits in the early, late 90s, early 2000s, but now they've kind of backed off. They're PG, and so it's kind of marketed towards everybody, and they do a great job. So I think for some wrestling fans, it's never left, and for others, it's coming back.
Interesting. Yeah. And I was a big fan of the 80s wrestling, WWF. And I bugged out, I guess maybe, I don't know why, honestly. Maybe just lost interest, or I was getting older. But it was right before whatever the WWE is, and we're not going to get into all that, but whatever that became, is right before I left. I left right before that all kind of happened, and I haven't went back. And I know some friends that are still into it here and there. My kids aren't into it, and really at all. Probably for the better, because that's the last thing I need them doing is
jumping around,
jumping off tables,
doing elbow drops,
yeah. We don't need that. But yeah, I mean, I definitely recognize it was a huge part of the '80s, and from there it just grew into what it is today. Maybe someday we'll talk about XFL, but all right. So enough about the Alan Parsons project and wrestling. So the other reference in here. So let's get to that reference, right? It's Highlander 2 lame. So I'm taking you're a fan of Highlander 2, which I'm going to challenge you on, because this movie really bothered me when it came out. And here's why. And I don't even know where to start on this one, because I was thinking about this. I'm like, okay, so we're talking about Highlander 2. He jumps over Highlander 2, and do we really want to get into talking about Highlander 1 and all of that? But the thing, let's talk about Highlander 1. Let's just start there, right? All right. So Highlander 1 was released in 1986. It's got Christopher Lambert as Connor McLeod, and it's a story that takes place in 1985. He's like this immortal that can't die. Well, I guess that's redundant, but he's an immortal. But the only way he can die is if he's beheaded. And it's kind of like this series of flashbacks that kind of tell the tale of his origins. And he befriends another immortal named Juan Sanchez Villalobos Ramirez, who's played by the equally ethic Sean Connery of Fountain Bridge, Edinburgh, Scotland, right? Which I never really understand why they gave him that name.
I don't either.
Yeah. And, so the whole movie's about, he's training. So they've got these immortals that are running around. They're part of this little thing called the Gathering. And it's Ramirez that tells McLeod, he tells him he's an immortal. He kind of teaches him how to do sword fighting. He kind of becomes a mentor to him, and tells him that, all these other immortals are running around, and, they're trying to decapitate one another. And this is where we get the catchphrase for the whole series, which is there can only be one, right?
There can be only one.
Yeah, there can only be one.
There can be only one.
There can be only one. Okay, sorry. Obviously, I'm not a huge fan of the series, but although the first movie, like I said, is okay. It's kind of cheesy and it's kind of cultish for me, but I actually enjoy it. It's fun. It's a fun movie to watch. And so this whole competition is called The Gathering. And I'll make this real quick because I want to get to part 2. So eventually he confronts, he being McLeod, confronts like this last immortal whose name is Kurgan, right?
Yeah, played by Clancy Brown, which I love.
Played by the amazing Clancy Brown.
So good in so many things. He's actually in a video game called Detroit Become Human. He does a fantastic job in anything he's in. Yeah,
and he's also in Rebels. But anyways, he's been in a lot of stuff. Lost is another one that I really liked him in the TV series. But so Clancy Brown, it plays this, and it's a very young Clancy Brown, obviously. He plays this the antagonist, and so McLeod and him, Kurgan, get into a fight. Connor, McLeod wins, chops his head off, and as his prize, he becomes mortal. So he's no longer immortal, and he can have kids. And then somehow he has the ability to read minds, but whatever. We don't need to get into into why that is or anything like that. That's the story, kind of really high level and terribly outlined by me for part 1. Part 2 is where things for me it
falls apart.
So Highlander 2, it's like the wheels not only come off the bus, but the whole bus goes off a bridge and plummets into like this steaming lake of poop, because it's terrible. They throw away so much of what was set up in the first movie. Like there's things that they just completely did. So there's a couple of versions out there. So first off, I saw Highlander 2 in the movie theater. So Highlander 2 was released in 1991. So it was almost like 5 years after the original came out. And I don't remember catching the first one in the theaters. That was one that I definitely caught like on VHS at some point. But when 2 came out, I was like, all right, I enjoyed the first one. It's 1991. I was I think I was almost a senior in high school, and I had money, I had a car. I went out to see this movie, and it really wasn't at all. I mean, there's a lot of problems with it, but the movie I saw in the movie theater, is not the same movie that if you were to go find it right now, like on Blu-ray or digital release, it's not the same version. There's actually like 3 versions of this movie that have come out. So before we get into that, let me just pause right there and let me ask, where were you, I guess, with the first Highlander and the second Highlander? Were these movies that you picked up at the time? Were they things that you came back to later in life, either through VHS, DVD, digital, pirate, whatever it was?
Well, I think Highlander, the first one was like, once it came out, it was all over HBO and all of those premium channels, right? So that's probably where I picked it up, because I wasn't, going to the movies. Certainly wasn't going to the movies, see a movie like this in 1986. I was 10 years old. So, I picked that up on television or on HBO or wherever. Highlander 2 was one that, again, I caught later on, but I loved the Highlander series. So, like, I loved the whole lore behind it. Again, it's very fantasy. It didn't start out as sci-fi. It was very much fantasy, and I really enjoyed the first one. And I mean, it's Sean Connery, man, and Christopher Lambert. Yeah. I mean, those guys, like, they're good. Plus, it's Raiden and James Bond in movies together.
Raiden from Mortal Kombat.
That's right.
If you didn't catch the reference.
So for me, I mean, I really loved the whole series. 2, I caught later on, and it's not good. I try to pretend it didn't happen. It's like Star Trek 5 for me. I just pretend it did not happen. It never came out. And when you made me watch it again, I tried finding redeeming things about it. And the acting isn't terrible on Christopher Lambert's part, or on the incomparable James Bond. Sean Connery.
Sean Connery. Yeah.
Like, it's not terrible. And even the love interest, she's in a ton of stuff. She's been in a ton of stuff. And even
a whole bunch of bad movies, but she's been in a lot of things.
Well, yeah. And the antagonist is always, he's always playing a bad guy as well. I recognized him from a ton of stuff. But yeah, you're right. They just kind of took a big steaming dump all over Highlander. Like, they took this great story, this love story, and then this great fantasy world that they've created that was rich with all kinds of possibilities. This guy who has lived for thousands of years and has collected all of this stuff and all of this knowledge, and he has lived, and he has become the only one. And now they're like, oh yeah, by the way, they're aliens from another planet, and they can choose to come back if they want to. What?
Well, yeah, and so that's where I have a problem with this. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, it really, they just took a crap all over the first movie. Yeah. Like, threw away a lot of stuff like we weren't going to remember. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just okay, sure, we'll take it at face value that, suddenly they're aliens. And by the way, so you just hit on something. When the original theatrical version of the movie has the 2 characters, McLeod and Ramirez, as being aliens from another planet. And when they came out with the Renegade version that was released, I think I don't even know what year it was, but it was a home release that came out. And then the subsequent version that was released after that, they've changed it. And now they were time travelers. So they were sent from the past to the future, rather than being aliens from another planet. And don't get me wrong, both of them were pretty dumb in their own respective ways. But it just kind of throughout the first part of the movie where, they meet in the very first movie for the first time. Right. And then suddenly we have this either quote flashback, or they're on another planet a long time ago and they know each other and they're best buds and they have this little ritual thing together. And he tells them, hey, we can never be separated, the 2 of us. And yet we're supposed to believe that in, the movie that came just before, that they, didn't know each other, and he didn't recognize him.
You kind of have to take 2 as a reboot, because if you don't take it as a reboot, then it makes absolutely no sense. And I didn't want to go look at 3 because I didn't want to be disappointed, because I love this series. Again, okay, so like some people get upset because I'll poo-poo Krull, for example, right? I don't want to poo-poo this. Because I don't want to be upset, because this for me has that nostalgia. It's all subjective, right? So for me, I really love the Highlander series. So I'm trying not to poo-poo 2, even though 2 is so god awful. Like it was hard to watch. It would, like, I got through everything, all of the challenges this week. I nailed them all. And I had a really hard time getting through this one. This was the hard, and I love the series. Like, there can be only one, even the TV series, which was not good. I watched because there can.
It had a pretty good run though, too.
It did. But I think that was more the female viewers for the lead. I don't even remember his name, but
So if I could just really quickly, and I'm not making any of this up. I'm just going to preface this right now. This is all right out of the movie. I promise you. So the premise of Highlander 2 starts with what I'm guessing the writer was trying to capitalize on at the time, which was the sensationalism that the ozone was depleting right back in the 80s. And I remember this very vividly. It was all over the place. They were talking about it in schools. It was on the news. And I'm not saying, I'm not going to argue the merits of science or anything else. All I'm saying is it was something a lot of people were talking about. And it almost felt like when this movie was written, they were trying to capitalize on that and try to make way. So the premise is that, the ozone layer is being depleted. It starts off like in the year 2024. And the ozone is pretty much all but gone. There's this company that creates this like tower or something that can block out the sun's harmful rays. But as a result, the whole world is like in perpetual darkness. So there's humidity and heat. So just basically think of Houston, Texas. That's what the world's become. And I'm kidding, Jonesy. And now this like shield that they've created is been taken over by like this, corporation and they're using, charging a ton of money to kind of keep things going. They're charging people taxes and all that to keep the harmful rays out. So far, all of this on the surface seems kind of reasonable, if not viable, right?
I suppose it kind of sounds like a social justice warrior movie before social justice warriors existed.
Yeah, this is the prototype for it. So then McLeod, right? So you find out he created the shield. Okay.
Right? Like out of nowhere.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And I think there's a line in there that just gives you a quick reference that he used. So again, at the end of the first movie, he gains these mind reading powers and somehow, and he alludes to the fact at the end of the first movie that he's going to use this for good. And so you get the sense that he's helped create the shield thing or whatever it is to block out the ozone or the sun's harmful rays by using his mind reading powers to kind of bring all these people together and build it. But whatever. He's lost control of the corporation. And when we see McLeod for the first time in the movie, he's like super old, right? And he's at an opera house or a theater watching a movie or not a movie, but a play or something, an opera, whatever. And he sees this scene where this character like twirls around on stage and he immediately has this like flashback that reminds him of Ramirez, he gets a flashback of McLeod, Ramirez, and they're fighting this guy that's named Katana, and that's played by Michael Ironside. So you mentioned him. He was in Scanners, Total Recall, Watchers, and I think the biggest movie for him was Starship Troopers.
Oh yeah, for sure,
from 1997, right? So Michael Ironside plays the antagonist named Katana, and we learned that they're at war. So McLeod and Ramirez were at war with Katana, and Katana wins. He captures him. They're put on trial, held, in front of these judges. And the judges, as for their punishment, they give them, again, depending on which movie version you're watching, they're either exiled to Earth and they have to partake in the gathering and fight amongst all these mortals, or the other version, the more recent version, where they're sent into the future and they have to, they have the same kind of fate. Well, Katana's not happy about this, and he eventually, we'll get to that in a minute. He eventually sends somebody out there. He sends these two dorky people to go fight McLeod and Ramirez. But where was I? I'm getting lost in this. Okay, so go back to, so we come back and we're back to the old McLeod, right? And he meets this like woman by the name of Louise Marcus, who's played by Virginia Madsen, and she's looking for somebody to help bring down this tower. She worked there, and she kind of has a hunch that maybe that the ozone layer is really not as bad as it is, and she wants somebody to help them out. So those two bozos show up, and I think it's in an alley fight or something, if I remember right. These guys show up from the future or from another world, and they start fighting McLeod. McLeod kills him. He takes her powers, and then suddenly he's no longer old. He's young again, so he's like 30 years younger, and he looks like Christopher Lambert would look like in 1991.
Well, the quickening, man, it made him immortal again.
Oh yeah, that's right. He's immortal again. I forgot. Yeah. And then he starts making out with her. Like I don't. That part always weirded me out. Like, but whatever.
It set unhealthy expectations as an adolescent.
Yeah. And then he's able to resurrect Ramirez too, right? Immediately he can because early on they and I kind of skipped over this. Early on there's one line in there that says Ramirez looks over at McLeod and says, "Hey, we can never be separated. Death can't even separate us." And I'm paraphrasing here. So that's the way they kind of worked Ramirez back into this movie. And the way he calls him is like Beetlejuice. He calls his name like 2 or 3 times. And then Ramirez suddenly, is brought back to life, and I think he pops up in Scotland. I think is where he reappears,
and he gets a suit, and it's the most glorious scene in all of moviedom. Oh, come on, Sean Connery drinking what I can only assume is scotch, smoking a cigar, and making all of these guys who said it would take weeks to get a suit have them get it done by 3:00. It's brilliant. It is movie genius,
movie magic. Oh man, I don't know if I want to keep going on here.
Do you have to? Because it's painful for me to even listen to. It's so bad. It's so bad. Yeah. Can't we just say that they saved the day and then everyone forgets that this movie was made?
But you're skipping over the part where they climb up the mountain and go above
in a ladder. They climb the mountain with a ladder. I could never understand, why did somebody build a ladder to the top of a mountain? I have no idea. I don't either.
Yeah, there's so many things that are just wrong. So yeah, they save the day. That guy Katana, Michael Ironside's character, comes back whatever. It's confusing depending on what version you're talking about. But he ends up fighting. He kills Ramirez. Right? And
Ramirez kind of sacrificed himself.
Ramirez jumps into. He kills himself. Whatever. It's the same thing.
Whatever. The other standout for me is that the corporate goon, right? The guy who's in charge, who's just in it for the money.
I skipped over.
He's the lead or the lead doctor from Scrubs, which is one of my favorite shows of all time.
And I forget the actor's name.
I do too. He's so good.
He's super young in this movie, obviously, but yeah. Funny guy in Scrubs. Yeah. I've seen a few episodes with him.
He's a great actor, and this was just everything about this movie was over the top. So his acting was over the top as well. So, I just...
I'll cut to the end. So McLeod fights Katana. He lobs his head off, and apparently he's the last immortal, right? Katana was. And so, basically, depending on... Okay, so there are basically 2 endings. If you watch the version where they went forward in time, the movie ends with McLeod and Marcus, the girl that worked there, he falls in love with, he made out after killing people. They kiss, and it kind of pans up, and you can see the earth, and it's literally the end. They roll credits right there. That's how it ends, right? And then there's the original movie version, which is what I remember, and that's where, like, after they kiss, he tells her, and we skipped over the fact that he's confided in her. He told her everything, that he was an immortal, and that he was from another planet and all of that. But after they kiss, he kind of points up at the moon, and there's like a little star, and she's like, "Well, where are you from?" He's like, "Oh, you see that little star next to the moon?" And there's like a million stars on the screen. So whatever. And he says, "Do you want to come with me?" So he convinces her to kind of talk, to come with her, or to come with him. Sorry. And they kind of float in space for a little bit, and they start kissing, and then like there's this big flash of light, and I don't know, you kind of almost assume that they become like star children, or they transport to the planet or something. But that's the movie version that I remember, and it kind of ends with that floating kiss in space kind of thing. And that's kind of it. But it really is. It's lame in the fact, and I don't want to judge the whole series, but if just taken at face value of this particular movie, it's lame in the fact that it just, again, took a crap all over the first movie in a lot of different ways. And it was very confusing, as a moviegoer at the time, somebody who liked the first Highlander, to see this movie and really just walk out of there going, what the heck happened? And there's a very valid reason for it. In a nutshell, it just boils down to the fact that they ran over money, and the company that, I guess the holdings company or whoever it was, had a chance to go in and edit it. And so they made some changes. And so it just kind of handed off. It was passed around through a lot of different revisions. And so it was almost Frankenstein, I guess, so to speak. It was never really cohesive in the way you would think a movie would be. And it very much comes across. I'm not making an excuse for the movie, but there are very valid reasons as to why this movie came out as clunky and poorly written, poorly directed, or whatever you want to call it, that it did.
And that's not unusual even today for a movie to pass through so many hands, so many revisions, that the original idea gets completely lost because the powers that be put people in charge to either they want to get a specific message out, or they don't like the first revision, so they're going to go with the second revision. They don't like the second revision, they're going to get the third revision. Somebody gets fired at the movie studio, somebody else comes in, they don't like any of it, so they start from scratch. So it's not unheard of that this happens. It's just unfortunate that it happened to a movie that, in my opinion, the whole series is taken together is pretty good.
Yeah.
And that's my, I love it.
Any final words on the Highlander series, or at least Highlander 2 before we move on?
Highlander 2 has never happened.
Oh yeah, I think it's her. We'll go with that. So going back to the book, so he's going on, they're talking about, Lady Hawk again. They're still talking about Lady Hawk. And H makes a reference that he doesn't care if Steven Spielberg directed it, still would be a lame movie. And so just real quickly, we're not going to talk about Steven Spielberg, at least on this show. There's a ton of more references coming up and opportunities to talk about that. But I kind of threw this question out to you just real quickly. Do you have a particular favorite Steven Spielberg movie?
Yeah, I do. And I don't want to sound like probably everybody else on the planet, but I have two, and they're equal in my eyes. Raiders of the Lost Ark, and equally good is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Very interesting choices.
Why is that interesting? Now I feel like I made a mistake.
No. They're both. Well, no, there's no mistake. There's just so many great movies by Spielberg. Even like his later stuff, like, you think like Schindler's List or Saving Private Ryan is up there for me, to be honest. Just because I've always had an affinity for World War II and history in that particular era of history. But and not to spoil anything, but we've already recorded episode 5. I think, episode 5, which is going to be coming out next month. And there's a reason why I won't get into that right now. But when we recorded it, we were kind of talking about there's a section in there where we actually dive into the Last Crusade, and I made mention there. So you're going to hear it now. You hear it again. My favorite movie of all time is Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it's not. And if you know me, you'd probably think it's Star Wars or one of the Star Wars movies, and it really isn't. For me, Raiders of the Lost Ark was the first movie that had there was a physical effect for me, because I went to a movie theater. It was the first time I'd ever seen a movie in a movie theater. Everything prior to that was at a drive-in. But it was just that experience, right? That kind of puts it up as not only my favorite Spielberg movie of all time, but definitely my favorite movie of all time. So I'm right there with you, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah, I think Raiders is one of the top 5 movies for me of all time, without a doubt, and which means Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is top 5 because they're equal in my eyes. They're both very good, well written, and obviously Last Crusade has Sean Connery, and I'm a big Connery fan. I loved all of his Bond films, and those, like, I remember Raiders of the Lost Ark was the first movie that was semi-adult that my parents were like, yeah, okay, fine, you can watch this. And I loved it. And at the very end, so I'm a biblical and theological studies student, and so the whole Ark of the Covenant and what it did when they opened it, and how it went after the Nazis, and how Jones was like, "Don't open your eyes, no matter what." It all just came together for me at a time in my life where it just made an impact. So it's such a great movie. And you're right. He does have other movies. Like, I love almost all of his movies. I don't think I can think of one Spielberg movie where I'm like,
1941.
See, even that one I'm okay with.
I'm okay with it too.
Yeah. So I don't like, it's just, his work as a whole is just great. But these two stand out to me.
Yeah. We won't talk about Jurassic Park, but I think I mean, again, there's probably podcasts that are dedicated to Steven Spielberg, to be honest.
Probably should be.
So or there shouldn't be. There's an idea for a show. So going back to the book, he makes, and this is, again, we're like 10 sentences in this chapter. We get another pop culture reference. Because H says he was getting a little pissed off because, Parsons was getting a little pissed off because H is really letting him have it now. and it's starting to get a little personal. And he says that he was a big fan of Legend as well. So Legend was on the homework assignment. So Legend was released in 1985. It was directed by Ridley Scott and had there's a ton of people in here, but the big three are obviously Tom Cruise, Mia Sara, and Tim Curry. And this is another one of those movies that came, like I mentioned earlier, was there was a big initiative going on. I guess a bunch of movies were coming out that were all kind of fantasy based, and this is one of them that kind of fell right in that time era as well. And so let me just open that real quick for you. How did you do with Legend, and what's your history with this movie? Again, is this something that you saw back then? Is it something that you own or enjoyed watching, or was this like really just a hard 2 hours to get through?
Yeah, I'll be honest, this time it wasn't a hard 2 hours to get through. And it's probably because I passed on this movie as a kid. And you would think about this time I would be really into this kind of a movie. But again, as I've said on the previous two shows, my dad didn't really want me into this kind of stuff. He would rather me be into sports and like Raiders of the Lost Ark and that kind of adventure stuff, and not this fantasy stuff. So for me, watching it this time, I got through it. I'm not going to say it was great. I might not say it was good, but it's passable. I mean, if you like Tom Cruise, which I'm not a big fan, but I'm also not a big critic, I can tolerate most of his movies. It's not terrible. You look at Krull, and that was more fantasy, less sci, right? And you look at Highlander 2, and that was more sci, less fantasy. This one is just straight up fantasy. So I guess if you can suspend disbelief, right? If you can and just go in and enjoy the movie, and Tim Curry, I mean, come on.
He's pretty good.
Anything Tim Curry touches is gold. So he brought a lot to the film for me, especially the last part. I dare say, Albert, that I enjoyed this movie.
That's fair. I mean, so it's in going back to the reference in the book, he says when he talks about the only genre film with less balls than Lady Hawk is freaking Legend. And I got what he was saying when he says that, because it is a fantasy movie, but it's like, I mean, the music, right, is Tangerine Dream. First off, there's glitter like
everywhere,
all throughout everywhere. Yeah, the whole freaking movie, there's glitter coming down. You're like, where's this glitter coming from? I think
they just were at strip clubs throughout the shooting of this, and that's where the glitter came from.
Just carried over right from those. Yeah, it's like, and it's a love movie, or I guess a love story, sort of. It's never really
kind of
the one. So so quickly on the lows, like the intro. I don't know. There's another movie with more text that you've got to read.
Star Wars
than Legend. No,
at least
I mean, because even Star Wars is really 3 paragraphs, right?
That's true.
This is like one page, and then wait, there's more, and there's more, and next thing you know, 5 minutes, and you're still reading. I'm like, is this a movie or is it a visual book that I'm watching?
Sure,
here?
But I mean, if you contrast that to Krull, where there was nothing, I mean, this would have been
there was a narrator,
right? If this would have been preferable to what we got in Krull, right? Yeah. I wish Krull would have had this, where they were like, this is what's going on, this is everything that's happening, here's everything you need to know, because we didn't shoot any of this. So at least Legends was like, we didn't shoot any of this, so we're going to give you all of the backstory you need to know to understand the story we're going to tell you.
Yeah, and they did a really good job of explaining all of it.
They were very thorough.
It's very, very thorough. No question of where you were starting with this movie.
That's right.
And in a nutshell, it's Tom Cruise and Mia Sara's character. I think she plays Princess Lily, and he plays Jack. Again, it's a love story. They're together, they're in love, and then they get separated. And there's I guess another beast, right? It's very similar in it's supposed to be like the devil, I guess.
Lord of Darkness, isn't that what he was called?
Lord of Darkness, sure.
You're like, yeah, whatever. It's Tim Curry, and it's just amazing dialogue.
It's just amazing, right? And there's a unicorn that's involved here.
Two unicorns.
Two unicorns. Yeah. One, gets his horn broken off, and the whole premise is Jack, getting some new armor, a shield, a sword, It's kind of very similar again to some of these other movies. He meets up with some other characters, like a fairy, and what is an elf, or I don't know what he was supposed to be. That creepy looking boy that looks like when he talks.
Right. It looks like yeah.
I don't know, but it was always creepy. It was creepy even now. Like when I watched it, it's like he's just have a kid's voice, and it sounds like I don't know.
Do you remember that the Looney Tunes cartoon where the kid? It was like he was half boy, half goat, and he'd run around with a pan flute. That's kind of what I pictured this kid was supposed to be.
No, you're probably not far off on that one there. It had some really good antagonist characters too. Like not only so we talked about Tim Curry, who again was amazing in that, but like Blix, right? Blix was that goblin that came out of like the water. No, Blix was the goblin that was shooting arrows. But I'm talking about that green hag or whatever, sea hag or whatever that came out of the water.
He's like, "You're not going to eat me, ma'am, are you?"
Oh,
he was very polite.
That thing freaked me out as a kid.
He was very polite to it, though. I mean, always be polite, kids. Even when the lake monster wants to eat you, be polite.
And so I was like 13 years old, 14 years old when this came out, and it still creeped me out. And even now I looked at it, I was like, it's pretty gross. Like the way it looks. I think they did a really good job with the special, I guess the practical effects.
I was going to say this movie, that one of the highs for me is the practical effects. They kind of like, I know there's discussions that the practical effects in Star Wars don't hold up. But I feel like the practical effects hold up a lot better than the special effects of the time. So I'm all for practical effects in these type of movies.
Yeah. And they, so they go on this quest. They eventually get to, the Lord of Darkness's chamber. And they've got this whole thing where they set up where they've got all these mirrors or plates and stuff. And the way they defeat it is they get sunlight to kind of flash. They bounce sunlight off a couple of different things. It hits him, and Jack fights him. And at the very end, I guess he goes off into space. I don't really understand the ending there. And then he says he'll be back, kind of thing. And he rescues yourself. I'm really kind of toning this down just in the sake of time, but. Again, it is one of those movies that, visually it's very, fairy-like. It's very fantasy-like. Again, we talked about the glitter, the music, which was done by a band called Tangerine Dream. I'm going to go out on a limb and say you don't like Tangerine Dream.
That is a low for this movie. No.
And so no surprise, I actually like these guys.
I knew it. How did I know?
Well, here's the thing.
Did they go on tour with Duran Duran or Oingo Boingo? I mean,
no, they didn't. Right. But they did. So this particular band is so. Those of you that don't know, Tangerine Dream, excuse me, is a German electronic music band. Yeah, they were started in 1967. But these guys are one of the. So I listen to a lot of synthwave, and think Stranger Things, right? Or think the intro. If you listen to the intro, the outro of this show. That particular kind of music. And there's a lot of things that, if you look at modern day synth and what they're doing, it all calls back obviously to the 80s, but really the stuff that came out in the 80s calls back to what Tangerine Dream and others like them were doing back in the 60s and 70s. There's a long history of synthwave and synth music that predates even what we all know, I guess more commonly know as, in the 80s type stuff. So these guys have been around forever, and they've done a lot of other movies. I mean, they did like Risky Business. They did obviously Legend, Firestarter. They did a great soundtrack for a movie called Sorcerer, which is a terrible movie, but the music is really good if you like synthwave kind of stuff. So I really actually enjoyed the music, but it's so light. Like it's not dark kind of synthwave. It's very light, fairy kind of stuff, and it's almost like puts you to sleep at times because there are some slow moments in this movie. I wouldn't say it's like. It's not riveting. You're not on the edge of your seat trying to watch what's going on. So couple that with some of the music in there, it can get a little slow. The pacing can be a little slow at times. The minute Tim Curry's on, it's like, it's eye opening, and you're kind of pulled right in just because of how dominant and how he upstages just about every character when he's on screen. But yeah, so you're not a big Tangerine Dream fan.
No, sir. No, sir, I'm not. I'm wondering if you share your love of synth and Tangerine Dream with everyone.
No, probably not.
Probably smart.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, probably not. And it's not really a big, the There's certainly pockets where it's pretty big, and there's a lot of people that are rabid fans. But
is it like a subreddit? Is there like a subreddit you could join?
It's a subreddit. No, it really is. If you want to find the subreddit, go look up /outrun if you want to follow that one. That one's a good one.
Can I start a different subreddit? Because I have a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, sure. What do you
I
got?
believe that Jack from this movie grows up and becomes Jack Reacher.
Oh
no,
we're
no.
I don't.
I was just trying to find a tie-in that would make me like this movie a little more.
I mean, so and this is another one that flopped. Like, so this is Ridley Scott, right? And he's obviously done a number of things.
Gladiator.
Never heard of it.
Doesn't have Tangerine Dream, of course.
Yeah, it doesn't have. It's a good point. It wasn't. Didn't have them, so I didn't really follow. But I lost my train of thought. Oh, so yeah, $30 million was the budget for this thing. In the box office, it only did 15 million domestic. Overall, it did 23 million. And so,
but you can see why, right? Like you can understand why. It's not that it's a bad movie. I just don't know that it's a good movie. Like it
and
it has
no. They really pushed. They were pushing. So when the movie came out, they were really pushing the fact that Ridley Scott had did it, and they were touting, hey, he's the guy that did Alien. He's the guy that did Blade Runner, right? I mean, they were really trying to sell the fact that it was him that was doing it. And then when Legend came out, it was kind of, didn't do as well as they thought it would.
But it does have, like, Tom Cruise is a big actor, Tim Curry. The goblin that you were talking about, the one that shoots the arrows with the big giant mask on, he actually looks like a goblin right out of the Final Fantasy video game series. So
maybe that was their inspiration.
That's what I was.
They drew that from.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. But it also has what's her name? Mia Sara. Yeah, from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So there are some really well-known actors in this, and I just don't know if Ridley Scott had the clout yet to do something like Legend.
Yeah, and and there's the truth is I actually own. So I have the DVD. What's it called? I meant to bring it in before we started recording. I have a DVD version that I bought, and it's got a ton of special features on there. It's got the original version, the theatrical version, then it's got a director's cut, which they rip all the music out from Tangerine Dream, which is interesting. Which you may actually like that more.
It may add something to the movie for me.
Yeah, but they kind of stomp all over that, and they made some other changes. I've actually never watched that other version, the director's cut of this movie, and I just know that it's not looked upon favorably because of some of the edits, even though I think it's like a director's cut or something. Which is interesting.
Right. Well, I can see out of all of the movies we've talked about on this episode, this is the one movie where I can say, I understand why this is a cult favorite. I understand why this movie has a following. I understand why people are passionate about this movie. It may not be my cup of tea, as you said earlier, but I get it. Like, this is the one movie where I'm like, yeah, okay. I can see why people really like this movie and they really want to see more of it. And they want more. They want those extras on that DVD. They'll go out and they'll buy it. So I get it. Like, not my cup of tea, but I totally understand.
Yeah. And there is a music video as well. If you haven't had a chance, I would go out and look up Legend, the music video. And it's by, I believe it was Brian Ferry who did that. I'm forgetting now who did it, but the song was called "Is Your Love Strong Enough?" And it's very interesting. I'll just leave it at that. I didn't give you that as a homework assignment,
challenge.
But if anybody as a challenge, probably more of a challenge. But if you get time, go look up the music video and watch it, and you'll be scratching your head wondering why this was ever made.
All right,
so
perfect.
All right. Any other final words on Legend before we move on here?
No, I think I've said everything I need to say about it.
Yeah. All right. Me too. So, quickly, he mentions that he says, I snatched the Starlog magazine out of his hand, threw it against the Revenge of the Jedi poster on the wall. And we get another reference immediately for Revenge of the Jedi. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but for those of you that don't know, originally, we all know Return of the Jedi, which was released in 1983. It was, the third movie of the original trilogy. And at one point, just months prior to release, this movie was called Revenge of the Jedi. And it's well documented that, Lucas, kind of made a decision 0 hour, I think, and it was like somewhere in at the end of 1982, around that time, he made a decision that the word revenge was an award that he wanted to associate with Jedi, that a Jedi wouldn't go out and seek revenge. And so because of that, they changed the name to Return of the Jedi. And of course, that's what we know today. But they did print out posters. There were a number of posters that were printed out that said Revenge of the Jedi. I want to say there was other marketing materials, maybe even some toys that came out. I honestly don't know if that's particularly true or not, but I know that at least the movie posters were out. And you can find these now. They're reprints, right? I mean, if you found an original, they go for quite a pretty penny. But you can find reprints pretty much all over the place, and then it's got a picture of Vader. It's got a picture of Luke and Vader fighting in what is the scene from like the throne room. There at the end of Return of the Jedi. But yeah, that's kind of the reference and where it kind of stemmed from. One other thing I was going to mention. Those posters were only available, I believe, on the Star Wars fan club. So if you were a part of that, you could buy them for like $10 or something. But they weren't like sold in the stores, and that's why these things are so highly priced these days. So, did you ever have one of these, or did you just get straight into Return of the Jedi?
No, I just got straight into Return of the Jedi. But later on, because I'm such a nerd, I read all of this and got into it. And I always think it's interesting how Lucas has these ideas and then he changes his mind. And it really does. I mean, change pop culture. I mean, in ways that we probably can't even begin to fathom. So it's an interesting tidbit that he threw this in the book. And I think it's just a nod to his knowledge of pop culture and his way of elegantly throwing it in the book.
Yeah, and he's a pretty big Star Wars fan. I have a video that I'll post at some point where I did a really quick interview with him prior to The Last Jedi coming out, where I asked him, and it wasn't a formal interview. I don't want to state this in any way, but I just happened to be getting an autograph, and I had my phone out, was recording him, and I'd asked him a question about The Last Jedi and what his thoughts around who Snoke was, and what Rey's origin was, and he kind of gave me his take on it. So I won't share that on the podcast now, but at some point I'll upload that and you can kind of hear his take on it. But I know he is a pretty staunch Star Wars fan and knows his stuff. He's been on a couple of other Star Wars podcasts before where he came out and talked a lot of that stuff. So he can definitely hold his own. So it's no surprise that he threw this little tidbit in there for us.
Now, when you say impromptu interview, do you mean he caught me stalking him?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. He managed to get the gag off his mouth and was halfway through the bindings on his arms when I finally popped the question. So
there you go.
No, this was just something we did at a convention. But okay, so that's enough of Revenge of the Jedi. And then so at this point in the novel, we finally get introduced to Iraq, who is like the, for lack of a better word, I would say he's a tool, right? We call him a poser. He's this guy that thinks he knows a lot about 80s pop culture, or at least what Halliday was interested in. And H allows him to come into the basement, and there's this whole bit in there where Parsons was kind of talking about like he really doesn't understand why this dude's allowed to come in here, because he's just all he does is just causes a lot of problems, and he doesn't know his stuff and all of that. But,
which is what posers typically do.
Yeah, right. By definition, in fact, there's one part in that he mentions that he brandishes an oversized plasma rifle the size of a snowmobile. He says he does that in chat rooms, which is pointless. This guy had no sense of decorum. And it's funny because when I think back to like some of these, some of the older MMOs or even more recent MMOs that I've played, there's always that one person that you see, and they've got the biggest, gaudiest looking, weapon, and it doesn't do anything, but they have it on there just for visual effects, and it immediately reminded me of those kinds of characters that you see, standing around doing nothing. Right. They're not contributing anything in any way. They just want people to look at them.
My mount's bigger than your mount.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's Iraq right there.
We call them douchebags in the. Can I say that on this podcast? I don't even know if I can say that. Okay, we call them douchebags. I mean, that's what this guy's. And Parsifal like just nails it. Like, but there's such a rivalry between the two. Like, and you get that tension immediately that you kind of feel like, because Parsifal isn't on the same social status as the rest of these guys, that he doesn't have to try hard to fit in. He just fits in because of his knowledge, where this guy is on that social status, right? Like he's got the big mounts. He's got the big guns. He can go off world and do all these things that Parsifal can't do. And you feel that tension between them, because I think we've all been in that situation, whether it's in, like you said, MMOs or in real life. There's always that one douchebag who's going to try to one up you at every opportunity, even though he doesn't have to, because he has all the cards. Where Parsifal's an outsider. He's not. He was born into it. So like everybody can relate to that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's one quick reference, and again, because of time, we're not going to really get into it, but he makes a reference that he actually bummed a ride off of him one time and was, at Greyhawk or whatever. And he mentions Greyhawk, which is basically a Dungeons and Dragons settings. And there's a number of them out there. I think we've talked about the Forgotten Realms setting when we were talking about Dritz Jordan. There's Greyhawk, there's Dragonlance. They had all these different settings around that time in Dungeons and Dragons. But Greyhawk was like, it wasn't the original, but it was the one that whenever you talked about Dungeons and Dragons or they released new material, that was the campaign world that you were dropped into. And so, and it was like the default campaign for a number of years. I think from early 70s all the way up until like 2008. And it was all created by, a couple different people that contributed to it. But it was primarily, I want to say it was primarily Gary Gygax who actually created that particular fantasy land. So, he did mention in there that he bummed a ride off him. And at this particular moment in the book, you got IROC who suddenly decides he's going to try to, stump these guys and pulls out a cartridge. And they mention that, Parsifal sees a cartridge and he immediately recognizes what this is. And from here on out, it's like 3 pages of him just shaming IROC in terms of not knowing what he was actually holding, because, IROC says, well, it's revealed that he's holding a Swordquest game. But beyond that, he really doesn't have any more knowledge about what that game is, any of the titles that came out afterwards, the competition and all of that. So I'm kind of summarizing because I do want to just dive into the Swordquest series, which was a series of Atari 2600 games that came out from 1979 to 1984. Before we get into this, was this something that you were aware of? Had you ever heard of these games prior to the novel coming out?
Sadly, no. And I do a gaming podcast, and we sometimes talk about retro games until I read this book, I'd never heard of it. So, I mean, that's how off the radar this is, but it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, no, and it really is, because, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. The premise of the Swordquest games, and Ernie doesn't really get, it's interesting. He does not get into the part that is very relevant to the Oasis and the Hunt. He just mentions that, these games were the unofficial sequel to Adventure. And we know that Adventure was obviously a big inspiration for not only the book, but the novel and having Easter eggs and clues and all that. But the way this contest was set up and the way these games were set up and what you did to actually try to win these contests is very similar to the Oasis. And it's very similar to the Hunt, particularly in the novel and how the clues were set up, right? He had to parse different words from these different phrases and all that. That's all pulled directly from the Swordquest series of games. So, for those of you that don't know, so there's 4 games that were released. There was Earthworld in 1982. The sequel was Fireworld in 1983. There was a Waterworld that was released in 1984. It was a very limited release, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. And then there was supposed to be a 4th game called Airworld, and it never got released. All in. So all of these games were really, again, they were kind of sequels to Adventure in the way they played, the way they looked. When you went from one map or one screen to the next, you had that same kind of visual and the same sound that we had from Adventure. But we got this particular series of games was sponsored by so Atari put out this whole big competition, right? And the way it worked was you had the first game that came out, you would play the game, When you bought the game, you got the game, the instruction manual, and there was like this little mini comic book, right? And this mini comic book was released by DC. So think of at the time they were also doing Atari Force. Do you remember the comic book Atari Force that came with the old 2600 games?
Yeah. That was everyone like that was part of the fun of getting the video game, right? Because you could read the comic. You got this, especially if you like comics, which I did. So I love those.
Yeah. So they had partnered with DC and they were doing the Atari Force comics, but they had a particular series that came out for the Swordquest series of games. So the contest was pretty simple, right? So you played each game, you solved the puzzles within the game, and as you did, you would uncover these clues that you would use to create these words that form sentences. And then once you had all the sentences or all the words, you would send that off to Atari if you were selected or if you had them all right. And we'll get to all the finer details here in a second. But if you got all the words right, then you were invited out to, I guess, Atari headquarters somewhere. And then they had this special version of the game that you had like 90 minutes to play. And depending on what your score was or how many clues you uncovered in that 90 minutes, I should say, then you were, eligible to win the grand prize. So, excuse me, for Earthworld, which was again the very first one, the grand prize was this thing called the Talisman of Penultimate Truth. It was like an 18 karat gold talisman. It had gems on there like diamonds and one gem for all of the different zodiac signs. And this whole thing was worth like $25,000. It was awarded to Stephen Bell, this kid that was 20 years old at the time. And the story's true. He melted that thing down and used it to pay for the taxes on the talisman for winning it. But then he also used it to pay for some of his college. The Fireworld Award was this Chalice of Light, and that was won by a gentleman by the name of Michael Rideout. And it was just basically a talisman again, platinum, gold, diamonds, that kind of thing. It was worth $25,000. And as of 2005, which I think is the last thing I could find where Michael Rideout was interviewed, he still had this particular chalice somewhere safe, right? And then the last two were with Waterworld and Airworld. Those prizes were, there's some debate as to whether or not the Waterworld prize was ever given out. But we know the Airworld prize was never given out. So for Waterworld, it was a crown. And again, it had more gems and jewels and all that thing. It was a crown. And then for Airworld, they were supposed to be a Philosopher's Stone, which is basically this huge piece of white jade that was encased in like 18 karat gold. And again, more diamonds and more rubies. So you had all these things. They're all worth $25,000. So you're at $100,000 right there. After they got all four of the winners from these contests, had they completed this contest or completed this whole tournament, the winner, all four of those winners would then compete for some final prize in which they could win the Sword of Ultimate Sorcery, which was basically a pure silver sword with a diamond hilt, all kinds of gems, and that thing was worth like $50,000, right? That was the premise of the competition. I knew nothing about this at the time. In fact, I remember playing Swordquest, but it was one of these games that I had picked up in a dollar bin, years later, and really had no clue what I was doing in the game whatsoever. It didn't even dawn on me that there was this quest going on. And to be fair, and to be honest, I didn't even realize that there was a bigger, like you said earlier, I had no idea that this thing had even existed or that there was this much complexity around the contest itself.
Right. So is that the fault of Atari? Is that the fault? I mean, like, is it a marketing thing or is it just they were early? Like they peaked too early. Because think about if somebody did that today. I mean, with esports and all the things that you have going on there, and you even have 2K teaming with the NBA, and they've got their own E-League now. I mean, there's big money in gaming, and so this is kind of like the progenitor of that. But you're talking about
you're
talking about games here like the Swordquest series that used like revolutionary because it used elements of logic and the narrative plus an adventure game in it. And you had these players who were very good at it. But I don't think most players were really that good at it, right? So
yeah, no, that's fair. I would agree. I don't think, and we know from the numbers, honestly, there was only a handful of people that actually got past, that solved the puzzle for Earthworld.
Right.
Very limited number. In fact, when Waterworld was the competition was done, or at least when the game kit was released, there were only 50 people, approximately 50 people that had solved all the puzzles for Waterworld. So yeah, you're talking a very, very, very small number of people that got into this, or at least could figure out how to do all of this. So here's the part though that I want to cover that wasn't covered in the book about the contests. So whenever you were playing the game and you unlocked a clue, what would happen is you would see these two numbers that would come up on your screen. For example, it would say, I don't know, 14.5, right? So you unlock a clue and suddenly there's two numbers on there. It says 14.5. What you didn't know, what took time for people to figure out, was that was referencing page 14, panel 5. So if you you go back to that little comic book, right? You open up the comic book, and if you went to page 14 or whatever the number was, page 14, panel 5, there was a word that the artists of the comics had embedded into the image himself. And it was hidden. So like the word "the," or I'm trying to think of some of the other words. "Quest," I think, was one of them. But they had all these different words on these panels. So you would have to go through, and there was 10 words total. So you'd find all 10 words. You'd write them all down, but when you submitted your form, you could only submit 5 words on the contest entry form. So the question became, okay, well, which 5 of the 10 words are the words that we need to submit? What most people didn't know, and what eventually, I guess, they figured out, was on the inside cover of the very first issue, there's a particular passage, and it says, "Come questing with bold siblings twain, prime thieves of a ravaged earth, next journey to Fireworld, land of volcanoes' birth, waves without number, water's realm, but where of evils there, last ride the airs, winds heaven high, to claim a prize most rare." Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. So that was in there, right? And you read that and you're like, okay, yeah, really cool, right? Cool story, bro. What was interesting though is in that particular passage, there were 2 words that were highlighted. They were in a different color than the rest of the words, and the words were prime and number. So prime number was your clue. If you took all 10 words and numbered them 1 through 10 in the order in which you found them in the game, and you took the prime numbers, so 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7, those are the 5 words that you would submit. It seems so complex compared to what we get today. Would you agree, or you think this is something that was just, I don't know, could have been figured out by anyone?
No, this is extremely complex, especially compared to today. Like I was thinking as I was going and going through my notes and making notes, is there's not really, and this is the gamer in me that's going to come out, so forgive me. There's a huge difference between American gamers and Japanese gamers, and developers who run MMOs, who are typically Asian. So Square Enix, they have an American division and an Asian division. Well, Yoshi P he's the guy who saved Final Fantasy XIV. He has to walk that line between what American gamers can get done and what Japanese gamers can tolerate. There is such a disconnect between a work ethic, what American gamers are willing to put in as compared to the time and energy and focus that Japanese players are willing to put in. So if this were to happen today, I can't see very many American gamers being able to go after it and making any kind of dent in it, because we just don't have the attention span or the focus or the drive to do this. Even if the prize is a monetary prize of 25, 30, 40, even in the hundreds of thousands, it would have to be a prize in the millions to get American gamers' attention. And that's just, it's a difference in culture. It's not a difference in race. It's just a difference in culture, where the Japanese, they will grind and they will go after it and they will use logic and they will use all the tools in their tool belt, so to speak, to not only beat a game, but to master a game. And so if there's a prize, they'll go after it, and you will have tens of thousands of entrants, and they'll go after it. So it's just a difference in culture, and there's no way this would happen today. None, because Americans we just don't have the patience to do this, but it's brilliant. It's brilliant. If you did this today and you made it a large prize, it would go viral. And you would have,
I think it would too. Yeah, I agree.
I think you would have millions of players worldwide going after this. I just don't see American players being able to put the time and effort into actually making, any kind of real effort. It would be someone overseas who would end up winning, which it's not. It's just, again, it's a cultural thing. It's not a slam on Americans, and it's just a cult. No, it's just we are a fast paced here in Western culture. We are fast paced. It's now. Gimme. Let's go. Where over there it's, I want to master this. I want to become the best that I possibly can be. So I think it would be brilliant. I would certainly try to put as much time into it as I could, which would be about 3 hours a week.
Right. About 30 minutes. So yeah, I mean, and so like I said, they didn't have a lot of people that figured out all this in Earthworld. And then in Fireworld, like I said, there was about 50 people total. And they actually had too many people. They couldn't fly everybody out. So, they decided that they would do the most objective thing they could in order to pick a winner. And they asked every one of the people to write a letter telling them what they loved about the game. And they used that as the tiebreaker vote, I guess, to determine who would win. And I mentioned earlier, Michael Rideout was a gentleman who won. So I guess he wrote a very persuasive essay on what he liked about the game, and at least enough to get him into to compete in the little special game that they had created. So he ends up winning that. And as far as where the other two items went, we're talking about the Philosopher's Stone and the sword. Let me back up. The crown itself, that's the one from Waterworld. So Waterworld did come out. It only came out if you were a part of the Atari Club. So if you were part of that special fan club at the time, you got a version of that. There are some reports that Atari was legally bound to hold the contest because the game had been released. And so there are some reports that there was a contest that was held behind closed doors, and it was very hush hush, and there weren't a lot of people that were involved, and that crown may have been distributed. It could still be out there somewhere, owned by someone. But as far as the other two, there was one rumor that Jack Dremel, which is the guy that bought Atari back in July of '84, he was obviously the guy that kind of was in charge of Commodore at the time. When he bought Atari, there was a rumor that those assets transferred over to him. There's another rumor that they weren't transferred over to him and that they were actually owned by the Franklin Mint. So they were not part of the sale of Atari, and that the Franklin Mint just simply took them back, melted them down and used them for coins or whatever, plates, silver, gold-plated plates that they were hawking at the time on television. So
they we don't know. Alice sitcom commemorative plates now. That's what these are.
Exactly right. Yeah, circa 78. I mean, we just don't know. We don't know what happened to the Philosopher's Stone or that $50,000 sword, which obviously look really cool, but they were all created at one point. So
how amazing would it be if these two items, I'll go so far as to call them artifacts. If these two artifacts miraculously appeared on the market in the next 10 to 15 years, just imagine the value that these would go for at auction if they could be verified as real.
So yeah, I mean, that's again, going back to just taking it back to Ready Player One and the novel. There was obviously some heavy inspiration here in terms of, picking out words and trying to really analyze those words and the sentences and all that. Where I think he borrowed some of that to come up with Halliday's clues and the hunt.
I think it's great that as an author, he put this in there. He's like, this was my inspiration for Ready Player One. This is the inspiration for everything that's going to come with this big hunt. And I'm going to tell you what my inspiration was. I'm going to put it in the book in such a way that if you are reading and you are reading to retain and you are reading and you're using logic, you're going to be able to put this together but if you're just reading fast just to get through this, you're not going to get. So again, I mean, you just look at the contest itself in real life with the Swordquest contest, where you have to use logic and you have to use some brain power to kind of put into it. It's the same thing here. So there's a lot of parallels here. I think Ernie did a really good job with this.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So after he pretty much shames him, makes him feel pretty stupid, I guess the bell rings, so to speak. He knows he's got to get back to his class. School's about to finally start. And the last thing he says is he asks H if he wants to get together and do a spaced marathon. And they agree to that, and that kind of closes out the particular chapter. So I thought quickly we just talk about space, and it's a British television TV series, like a sitcom that came out. It ran from 1999 to 2001. There were 2 seasons, and these are British seasons, not American seasons, but 2 British seasons, which was 7 episodes. There's really only 14 episodes in this whole series. They're about 24 minutes. They're pretty short. And it stars Simon Pegg. It's got a couple of other people that, probably are, to be fair, probably bigger over there in the UK than over here. Simon Pegg's really the only one that I think stood out for me. I didn't recognize any of the other ones. But it could be there again. It was so old now. It's like 16, 17 years old that I didn't recognize him for whatever reason. But, I didn't really watch a lot of these episodes. I did it for the show, and because I'd never heard of this before. And it was not that bad from what I saw. I think the funniest thing for me, we were talking about this before we came on the air. There's one of the characters that's played by Simon Pegg is a character named Tim, I think Bisley or whatever. He's this comic book store clerk, I guess, who's really doesn't have a whole lot of money, and he's we can get into those. We're not going to really get into the whole plot, but
struggling artist.
He's bunking.
Struggling artist.
He's a struggling artist. That's probably a good way to summarize him, characterize him. But he's got this thing where he's obviously holding a whole lot of rage over the Phantom Menace from Star Wars. And every time someone mentions it, it triggers him, and he goes off, and like he loses his job, like he belittles this kid that comes into the comic book store because they get into this whole thing of Jar Jar, and he gets this Cluso twitch in his eye whenever someone says it. And I can't help but think of our friend Mike Rondo, who it seems like every time The Last Jedi is mentioned, this is the exact same thing that happens. It just triggers him. So that was a really kind of a cool little character. But did you get a chance to watch any of these episodes, and was it entertaining for you, or was it just kind of
I legit watched 3 episodes. So again, like, I have completed the challenges. I am waiting for my diamond encrusted sword, sir.
Oh, look, we're going bankrupt. We're not going to be able to get you that. So very similar to Atari.
Right? So I watched 3 episodes. It's about an hour and a half of my life I'll never get back. I sympathize with the Simon Pegg character because I'm not a giant Phantom Menace fan, nor am I a Jar Jar fan. So I can certainly sympathize with him. It's not a terrible show by any stretch of the imagination. As I sat there watching it, and it translates well, I suppose, into American. I mean, if you want to call it that, like, there's not a whole lot where you're like, I don't understand what they're talking about, as there sometimes is with British shows and British comedy in particular. Yeah. But I just don't know if it stands up well, even after only 17 years. Like I'm sitting there and I'm watching. I'm like, wait, what's that ringing noise that I recognize? Oh, that's their telephone. I remember having a telephone. I mean, I have a cell phone. And then I'm like, oh man, they can't get a hold of each other when they're not like this. In today's modern age, like most of these shows, even 15, 17 years, they just don't stand up. But it's not a terrible show. If you want to see more about what Ernie's talking about when he's saying, hey, let's watch space. I just don't understand, I guess, the connection between Spaced, which has nothing to do with sci-fi, has nothing to do with video games. It's kind of a weird reference to throw in the book, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah.
So maybe it's just something from like his younger days where he was like, I watched this. I enjoyed Simon Pegg before he got famous. I'll throw this reference in there. It was kind of a big disconnect when I watched the show, because at first I was like, oh, it's going to be some kind of sci-fi thing. Nope. It's just these 2 British people who are homeless and decide to pretend they're a couple and move in together. Yeah.
And no, it's a good point, because it is one of the, you're thinking back to all the references in the book. It's one of the very few references. It's not definitely in the 80s and barely makes it into the 90s. It's one of the, I guess, more recent references that we have in the novel. And so, like you, when I heard it, I had never heard of it before. It certainly wasn't something I remember from my childhood. So I'm like, So yeah, going back and looking at it, I would agree. I think it's probably just something, he wanted to throw in, or maybe he's a big fan of Simon Pegg, or wanted to, plug it and get people talking about it, maybe on a podcast. And mission accomplished, I
there
guess.
You go. Well, the next time you're stalking him and you get an opportunity, maybe you should ask him about that, because it does kind of stand out as something that's completely different. It's not even, you can't even say it's a pop culture reference, because we'd never heard of it. Like, it's not, I don't think anyone in America had ever heard of it, unless they were like,
no, and they actually tried to bring it out. They tried to bring the show out here in America. But because of the premise of the show, they just felt, and this is kind of going to your point earlier, like, it's just, there would be so much loss in translation bringing this show over to American audiences that they just decided, you know what, it's not worth it. Let's not do it. But yeah, I mean, outside of the UK, you probably haven't heard of this stupid show. So I wonder where he even heard it.
Exactly. I don't know. It'd be interesting to have that conversation with him and find out what his thinking was behind it. Because I can think of so many other, even if you want to go with a British show, Red Dwarf would be one that I would have thrown in here instead of this, just because it's at least sci-fi, and and most gamers, geeks, nerds, whatever you want to call us, will have heard of Red Dwarf. So I'm not really sure why he chose this one.
All right. Well, next time I see him, which he'll be at the coffee shop on Thursday at 4 p.m. So I'll make it an effort to head over there and ask him why he put in space.
I look forward to hearing his response.
Yep. Me too. So I think that's going to do it for chapter 3. I guess before we go, do you want to let everybody know where they can find you before we close this
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Bad Gamers Anonymous is my podcast with my co-host Garrick. We talk about all kinds of games. We talk about issues that confront gamers in today's modern age. And we even throw in some retro gaming reviews and stuff. So we're not very good. We're both bad gamers. So, but you can check us out, iTunes, SoundCloud, your favorite podcatcher, just Bad Gamers Anonymous. Until this next episode, we didn't know what anonymous meant, but Garrick ruined that bit. So now I've got to find something else.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to listen to that one. Cool. Thanks first off. So thank you again for both you and Mike for getting through chapter 3 with me. I know it was a pretty long chapter. There's a ton of references, but just wait, because chapter 6 is coming, and that's got even like 4 times the amount of references. So,
no, dude, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast. I love the book. I love your podcast. You do a great job. So I'm looking forward to hearing the rest, and just keep doing what you're doing, man. Plugging away, doing what you're doing. It's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but you're doing a great job. I absolutely love it. And you've made a fan out of me, sir.
Cool. So, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So looking ahead, we've got chapter 4 coming up, and I've got a legitimate rocket scientist who will be joining me on the show. I don't want to spoil who it is just yet. But in there, we're going to be talking Charles Dickens, holodecks. We'll be talking King Tut. We're going to talk about Jupiter, Io, Europa, the Great Red Sea Spot, or the Great Red Spot. We're going to get into some 2001, 2010, 2061, and 3001. For those of you that are fans of Arthur C. Clarke. We're going to talk about virtual worlds, and then we're going to end on like the Rubik's Cube. So we've got that coming up. If you'd like to follow us on their social media pages, you can find us on Instagram at The Basement RPO, Twitter at The Basement RPO, Facebook / The Basement RPO. We've got Vero. You can get us there at The Basement. We've got a Patreon page, a TeePublic page, and please, if you get a chance to give us some reviews or positive feedback, we appreciate that. Or if it's not positive, you can give us that too. I don't mind, as we had earlier. So, but yeah, you can do that on iTunes. We would appreciate all the good, kind words. So with that, we'll close it out, and we'll be back in 2 weeks to hit chapter 4. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you guys next time. The views and opinions of the Basement hosts are of our own and are not in any way affiliated with Random House or Ernest Klein. All quotes, music, sounds, trademarked, and copyrighted material referenced in the show are owned by the respectful companies and creators and are used by the Basement as fair use for entertainment purposes only. It would take me a month to read this whole disclaimer, but sad to say, I don't have that kind of time.